Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. Today I want to talk about something that I've been pondering for a while now. Several months ago, I think it was the beginning of the summer, the Pink Phantom in the Phantom Thoughts podcast put out a podcast about railroading, and they kind of posited that maybe everything is a railroad in the end, because eventually your choices are limited. Now, I will try to find the podcast and put a link so you can listen to it, because I think that I'm probably not making their argument very well. But I immediately disagreed, but I couldn't quite, and I actually had a note here on my computer to make a video about this, but I've thought about it a couple of times, and I've tried to make several videos, and I kind of start stumbling over myself. So we're going to give it a little bit of a break, and I'm back. So if the idea is that eventually, and I guess the example they give is, at the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark, so this is a spoiler for Raiders of the Lost Ark, I guess, Indiana Jones comes into, effectively, it's at the very, very beginning. He's in this, I don't know if it's a temple, but it's some kind of in-ground, like a cave, basically complex. And he's making his way through this complex to find this treasure, this basically ancient idol. And there's like a few things. There's like traps, there's arrows that shot, I think, They work their way through, navigating past the various traps. They get to the idol. They see that they posit that there could be an issue. So they do the sand thing. You've probably seen that scene many times. They weigh it out. They replace the statue with the sand. It's not correct for whatever reason. Giant boulder rolls. They come running out. Traps are going off left and right. They get out at the end. So wasn't that a railroad? Because he had no choice but to go straight through that cave. There wasn't a bunch of branching paths. There wasn't any place else for them to go. That was the only way to get the idol. And I think that for me, and I guess, again, this kind of argument doesn't really work for me, because I think we have to consider everything else that went into the situation. I mean, the first obvious thing is that if that was a group of player characters and they came upon the first trap and they were just like, oh, this is too deadly, we're going back, or we want to get more information, they could just leave. Right? They're not forced to move forward. They're making a decision. Now, they don't have a lot of decisions, but they do have a decision. They could go in, they could leave. A railroad would be, they go in, they turn around because they're like, oh, this is too dangerous, and the first trap they found closed them in, and they have no choice but to get to the end, right? That might be a little bit more railroady. But even then, as long as it was telegraphed and they could have made a way, if they could have figured out a way to not have that happen, right, maybe it wouldn't have been. So, but what's more important, and I think in this story, and kind of my point and my thought against it, is that you're taking the very end of what was potentially a long adventure, right? The character, Indiana Jones, had to have discovered this idol was there somehow. They had to have done their research. They did whatever they did to do to figure out where it was exactly, so they could just go right to it, right? They had a plane, right? They landed right there. They hired people. They got guides. They did their research. The reason why they were so good at the traps isn't necessarily that they were high level, but you could look at it that way, but maybe more like they knew there'd be traps. They knew the idol would be there. They had an idea about weighing it, This is the reason why they were able to get through the situation fairly easily and understand that, it was dangerous, right? They weren't just walking and going, oh, look, here's a place we could just walk into. They knew right away there might be traps. And even if they didn't know that, they still made the decision to go after this particular thing at this particular time with the particular resources that they had at their disposal. We don't know what happened before that, so it very well could have been a railroad that forced them there, but it could have been any number of things. If you're thinking about like a sandbox campaign, this might have been one of 10 treasures that they could have gone after, and this is just the one they went after. Eventually, in order to get to an end point, right, your options will start to fall away, right? Because as you make choices, other choices are eliminated, right? And if you're on a path towards a certain thing, there's only so many choices. So I think the idea that like it becomes a railroad is maybe not the right way to think about it. Because I think when you're looking at a railroad, as far as what we would call a railroad in gaming, a railroad is not a linear adventure. A railroad is not necessarily there's only one way to do something. A railroad is that the players, no matter what the players do, and again, this is my definition, the same thing happens, right? So if the players had somehow been able to figure out the right amount of sand, right, the trap shouldn't have gone off. And again, see, we don't know. We're not the referee, so we don't know what was happening there. If the players had left a guard outside, they would have got a signal and they would have known that that guy was going to come and steal the idol from them, right? There's lots of things that player characters could have done to overcome that if they had made the decision. We're just assuming that Indiana Jones did not, right? Later on, he makes all kinds of decisions. He decides who he wants to trust, who he doesn't, where he travels to, where the information comes from, and to get the Ark, right? This is basically the nature of all things. You start wide, right? When you start a campaign, the most basic way, right? If we're starting a campaign is you start in a town, let's say, and you give them 3 rumors of possible things going on. 3 is usually a pretty good number. And the party goes out and does one of them, and they come back, and then maybe 1 or 2 of those have already been solved without the party, and there's 2 or 3 new ones, and they keep making choices. But as they do that, if your world is actually connected together, and there is some kind of overarching, idea going on in the background, they will eventually run into it. And if they see it and they start pulling that string, they will start to narrow their choices, right? If the player characters, so in my campaign I'm running right now, there's a lot of things going on, but the player characters have chosen that there is something that they think is really important. And that thing is what they're pursuing. So because they're going after that thing, there's other things going on in the world. They're just not seeing. It's not that they're being railroaded. If they just suddenly stopped and were like, oh, what else is going on? Which, by the way, I try to do all the time, constantly giving them other side things to tempt them away from the thing they want to do. Players are creating their own railroad, if you want to think about it like that. They've got a mission. They're mad at this. So let me go all the way back to my 5e campaign that I started with. I've probably told this story a little bit before, but early on when I was running my first campaign in 5e, the 4th session in or something, the player characters, because I was very old school in my GMing, they already had a few magic items by the time the 4th session came, and they got defeated by this anti-paladin. And the anti-paladin, I decided, was kind of a jerk and didn't just kill them. And plus, TPK wants to do that. And I often love to have people get captured. That's kind of a running thing with me. But of course, he captured them and he didn't leave them their stuff. He took it. So one of my players for the entire 3-year campaign wanted his magic item back. It was a bag of tricks where you could reach in and there was little fuzzy balls, you throw them down and it creates a wolf or something. So this is not exactly the most powerful magic item in the world. This player character became a high-level ranger with all kinds of magic items, and he had an artifact, and he was a really powerful character. He still wanted that bag of tricks. And they would go to the end of the earth to get this bag of tricks. And they did. They eventually got it back. They created their own railroad because that's what they wanted to do. That's much, much, much different than creating a situation where the player characters only have one choice. Again, if you start a campaign and say you are all Knights of the Realm and your mission is to go to this other, village and free them from the tyranny of this dragon. Wasn't that one of the modules of Tyranny of Dragons? That's not necessarily a railroad. The railroad is not allowing them to be able to do anything but what you already planned. If they want to defeat the dragon in some other way, if they want to go to 3 other villages and get the people together, if they want to do more research, if they want to hit it from a weird angle, then that should matter. It shouldn't be that no matter what they do, the next scene just plays. There shouldn't be cutscenes between, the player characters making decisions where no matter what they did, their choices don't matter. That's a railroad. And I think that that's really where I stand there. I think that the idea, and I know that from Pink Fandom's point of view, they were saying, well, if there's no choices, it's a railroad. But I think there's always choices. And I think the idea that at some point we reach a point where finally there's no choices. But if that's the case, you've already made your choices, right? You've made your bed, as they say, and you're going to lay in it. If you start a fight with a very powerful entity and then keep poking at them, eventually you're not going to be able to just stop and walk away because now they're coming for you. And that's not a railroad. That's just the natural consequences of what's happening in the world. So I would love to know what you think, because I think it's a really interesting way to think about it. Is everything eventually a railroad? I might say everything eventually comes to a point or becomes fairly linear because of choices by the players. But I think the use of the word railroad was what really made me think, I don't necessarily agree with that, but let me know if you do in the comments below. Check out the Pink Phantoms podcast. It's great. They do a solo AD&D campaign. They've been running it for a while, and it's really fun listening to the recaps on there and all kinds of other fun stuff. But I will try to find the exact episode I'm talking about, and I will put it in the description below. Like the video. If you liked it, I'll talk to you soon.